Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an episode of An Inside Look today. We're going to give everybody a moment or two to join here. So while everyone is coming in, if you would like to hop on the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from, that would be great. New York City and Quito, Buffalo, Texas, New York. Look at everybody from New York State, Florida, Rhode Island, New Jersey. This is great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing this. Okay. Well, we have quite a crowd on already, so we'll get started. My name is Eileen Fielding. I'm your host today. I'm the director of the Sharon Audubon Center in Northwestern Connecticut. And this webinar is brought to you from the Audubon state offices of Connecticut and New York. And our mission is to protect birds and the places we all need in our forests, on our coast, and across local communities. Just a quick note, this webinar is being recorded and it will soon be available on our YouTube and Facebook pages as well. If you have questions, they're welcome in the chat box at any time. And then at the end, we'll have time for some Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to share those questions with Dr. Schmitz. And our presenter today is Dr. Oswald Schmitz, who will be explaining that although current thinking holds that natural climate solutions have a co-benefit of protecting animal diversity, it does not consider the obverse, that animal diversity can be an important driver of climate solutions. So protecting biodiversity can actually help battle climate change. Dr. Schmitz is the Oastler Professor of Population and Community Ecology at the Yale School of the Environment. At Yale, he teaches courses on the role of humans in nature and how humans can coexist harmoniously with nature. His book, The New Ecology, Rethinking a Science for the Anthropocene, encapsulates much of his thinking, making ecological science accessible to a broader readership. Oz is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. He served on the scientific advisory board of the American Forest Foundation Center for Conservation Solutions and as science advisor to the Open Space Institute's Climate Resilient Landscapes Initiative, and on the board of directors of the Ocean Conservancy. He currently provides scientific support to the Global Rewilding Alliance's effort to link animal conservation to carbon uptake and storage in ecosystems. This is called Animating the Carbon Cycle. So Dr. Schmitz, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And now I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all in the audience for joining in today. It's kind of apropos to present on this topic, given COP27 is going on right now, trying to figure out solutions to solve the climate crisis. But the thing is, everything that I'm going to talk about today isn't even being considered at COP27. They haven't even got their head around these kinds of issues, and I think they're really important to highlight. Because they are additional solutions to help mitigate changing climate. I'll start off here with a picture of the global carbon cycle, how people sort of diagrammatically outline it and look at the sources and fates of carbon in ecosystems across the planet. And basically the black numbers, I'm not going to get into detail and walk you through all the dizzying numbers, but basically the black numbers represent what nature does, and the red numbers represent how humans have changed nature or how humans have contributed to changing the carbon balance in the atmosphere. For example, by changing land use, and it releases this much into the atmosphere where it builds up. There's also fossil fuel burning and changing the ocean, temperatures and ocean acidity and all that. So there are various processes that humans have altered because of their transformation of the planet. You'll notice there's land here, there's vegetation here a little bit. They talk about the marine realm, but what's conspicuously absent is all of these animals that live in this. So the animals aren't even really considered in any accounting in the global carbon budget. Hopefully by the end of this seminar today, I will convince you that maybe we need to sort of rethink things and try and maybe account for the animal effects in a little more detail. One of the reasons why it can be useful is we're confronted with this important problem. And this is what people at COP27 are trying to deal with, is how do we reduce our reliance or our dependence on fossil fuel to reduce CO2 emissions and methane emissions to the atmosphere. And one of the major goals and solutions that have been presented in various COPs since the Paris Climate Agreement is really to think hard about reducing emissions by transitioning to renewable energy generation, and also protecting existing ecosystems so they don't emit all of the carbon that's already stored there. And if you do that, you can see that by 2020, we can draw things down. So by 2050, we would be at net zero. That's the goal, right? No new emissions to the atmosphere because we've completely transitioned to renewable energy generation. The problem with that is we still have this whole bolus of atmospheric CO2 that is resident in the atmosphere. And so even if we go to net zero too, we're still going to overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius and may even overshoot 2 degrees Celsius because that greenhouse gas effect is still in the atmosphere. And that's sort of a residual effect. And so what we really need to do is have negative emissions, not net zero emissions, negative emissions that actually suck out all of this atmospheric CO2 and store it on the planet. The estimated total, there are a whole bunch of numbers here just to distill that. The total is about 500 gigatons of carbon that we have to suck out of the atmosphere. That is the equivalent of 500 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we have to suck that out between 2030 and 2100 if we want to avoid overshooting 2 degrees Celsius. And so if you boil those numbers down, it's about 6 to 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. It seems like a daunting challenge. We have to sort of think about managing our planet in a different way and not just rely on technology, but also rely on nature. And so people are now proposing what's called natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. And part of that is already, avoiding emissions of 5 gigatons a year, but also enhancing the carbon uptake by another 5 gigatons a year. And that comes through managing working land. So you manage forests, you do reforestation, you become more smart about your agriculture, you manage your grazing lands in different ways, but you also restore a lot of nature and recover a lot of nature. And that together gives you about 5 gigatons a year. But if you recall what I said here, we need 6 to 7 gigatons per year. So there's a shortfall of about 1 to 2 gigatons. Even if we implemented all of these wonderful natural climate solutions. So what about the wild animals? How can they contribute? And that's what I'm going to talk about as thinking about wild animals as a natural climate solution, in addition to what's being proposed, not to supplant it, but actually expand the portfolio of climate solutions and think about animals as part of that portfolio of solutions. Now, one of the reasons why people haven't thought about animals is if you really look at the current storage of carbon on the planet, plants have 450 gigatons of carbon stored. They are by far the most abundant carbon storage on the planet, right? And then you also have a lot of soil microbiota, and they also contribute to a huge amount of storage. Animals, on the other hand, compared to 450, this is all animals on the planet. we're talking about arthropods, we're talking about worms, we're talking about wild birds here, we're talking about fish, we're talking about livestock, humans, wild mammals. We're talking about all of those, wild animals on this planet. They amount to a very small amount of carbon stored in their body mass. And so what people have said is that animals are going to be insignificant because, plants are really the place where most of the carbon's stored. And that's one reason why people are also really promoting the reforestation of the planet. So forests by far create the largest plants, and so by far you get the largest carbon storage. Now, this idea and this line of thinking is based on a classic view in ecology. If any of you have taken introductory ecology, even in high school, maybe you might have heard the idea of the pyramid of biomass or the pyramid of numbers, where as you go up the food chain from plants to herbivores to carnivores, you get progressively less biomass in each of these trophic levels. And that's because of that, so on average, 10% rule, right? 10% of all energy here ends up in biomass here, and 10% of the energy here ends up in biomass here. And so that's why you get this pyramid structure. But this all assumes that the whole world is driven by just the availability of plants and the habitat that plants provide, so that the animals just passively take advantage of this. But we're increasingly learning that animals actually have feedback effects. So despite their rarity in ecosystems in terms of biomass, what they can do is they can have feedback effects on these big biomass pools, and it's very dynamic. And those feedback effects can fundamentally change what the plants are doing. So even though you have a small amount of animal biomass on the planet, those animals can have a profound effect on what happens to the big biomass pool on the planet. And they can do that through various mechanisms. They can do it through trampling, where they just trample the vegetation and change the balance of energy exchange between the atmosphere and Earth, changing soil temperatures, for example. They can basically poop and contribute carbon to the soil. They can forage and damage vegetation, and so you get an exchange of less carbon dioxide being taken up through photosynthesis. They can also change the way the soil microbes convert organic matter into soil carbon storage. And so there's this dynamism that needs to be taken into account. And that's really what we mean by animating the carbon cycle. It's the animals through their dynamic interactions that are animating the carbon cycle. Here's just an example where we've learned, not deliberately, this experiment wasn't done. It was done for us because of an environmental disaster that happened at the turn of the 1900s. So what happened in East Africa is that they introduced cattle ranching to East Africa, like Kenya and Tanzania, and especially Tanzania. And with the cattle came a disease known as rinderpest. And rinderpest is deadly to all sorts of cattle, and wildebeest, for example, are cattle. They are bovids. And so the wildebeest succumbed to this disease. So historically, their numbers were about 1.2 million animals, and their numbers crashed down to 300,000 animals. And what happened was, because these wildebeest, which migrate throughout the Serengeti each year, it's a very famous migration, that migration virtually shut down because there weren't enough animals to move around. And so there was a lot of uneaten vegetation. Now, again, the vegetation contains carbon, right? Photosynthesis, it takes up the carbon, it builds biomass. And because it wasn't eaten, it dried out at the end of the dry season, and wildfires basically burnt up 80% of the Serengeti each year. And that 80%, was a significant source of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So what happened was they were able to eradicate rinderpest and rebuild the numbers. So the rinderpest went down. They were able to rebuild the wildebeest number to what they are today, back at their historical level. And you get this nice lush green Serengeti again, where the animals are grazing, they're migrating and grazing. And what they were able to do is use a historical record of carbon in the soils and vegetation samples. And they were able to actually trace the fact that as the wildebeest numbers increased, you saw more and more carbon being stored in the ecosystem, both in trees, through reduction of fire, the grazing. What the animals do is they graze, they eat the vegetation, and then they release it in dung, and then you have dung beetles that bury the dung in the soil, so you get soil organic carbon storage. And what ends up happening is you get the Serengeti becoming a net carbon sink again because of what the wildebeest have done. An example for the boreal region with moose. So you have predator-prey relationship. Wolves eat moose. They prey on them and keep their numbers in check. And so if wolves get killed, and there is culling of wolves in the boreal in Canada, there's culling of wolves obviously in northern United States also. And if you cull these animals, what you do is you get more of their prey, right? And in the boreal, you end up having more moose abundance, and the moose eat the vegetation here, and less of the vegetation available to take up the carbon in the first place, but also there's less carbon entering the soil as litter fall from the vegetation. And if you do the accounting, and these are estimates based on some measurements that people have taken in areas where moose are abundant and where both wolves and moose coexist, you take up 32% less carbon because of the absence of wolves. That is, the moose are quite damaging to the forest, and because the wolves aren't present, you're sucking up less CO2. And then a recent example from the Congo Basin, where, counterintuitively, we always think of animals like elephants just trampling everything and smashing the vegetation down and being very damaging to it. But what in fact happens is that these elephants, through their foraging in the forest, thin the understory vegetation. And by thinning that understory vegetation, it releases competition with these overstory trees that are really, really carbon dense trees. So the carbon dense trees, the ones that are by far contain the most carbon, are able to flourish and grow better. And moreover, they produce fruits that the elephants eat and disperse. And so by dispersing the seeds, they spread the chance of these trees sprouting again and regenerating. And so they're beneficial in the sense that they're counterintuitively, by damaging the understory, actually improve the overstory. And as you increase the elephant density, certainly the above ground carbon in the trees increases. Okay, it's, too many elephants can also be damaging, but up to a certain point, elephants can be quite beneficial, and they increase the carbon by 50% over conditions where there are no elephants. And again, those are estimates. But let's think of the implications of this for nature-based solutions. So the Serengeti wildebeest recovery, right? What that means is we end up with 6 million tons, or 0.006 gigatons of CO2 annually that's taken up by the Serengeti. That's the equivalent of annual fossil fuel emissions of CO2 from fossil fuel burning in Tanzania. So they're offsetting Tanzania's carbon footprint this way. Conserving wolves throughout the North American boreal forest, you get much more because it's a bigger region, obviously. This is only 12,000 or 14,000 square kilometers. This one is millions of kilometers, right? So you get much more carbon taken out, and that is equivalent to Canada's annual emissions from fossil fuel burning. So, keeping these forest and the food chains in the forest intact is a huge benefit for Canadian carbon budgets. And then restoring elephants to historical levels in the Congo Basin could actually take up another 15 million or 0.015 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually, which is the equivalent of France's annual emissions, right? So even though these are, if you look at the numbers and you look at the global carbon budget, which is 10 to 15 gigatons. So these are small fractions of the total global carbon budget, but they're regional solutions that people in regional areas can adopt and align with their culture and their values, and therefore make a contribution to global carbon balance. I just want to emphasize where this is overlooked. So this is a nature-based solution proposal for Canada, all of Canada, right? And so they're talking about sort of taking up 78 megatons annually, 0.078 gigatons of carbon annually through all of these kinds of management interventions and restoration interventions. But if we look at, the carbon value that just keeping these food chains and nature intact, the boreal forest intact, what you end up is taking up 3 times more carbon than what is projected by the nature-based solutions in Canada so far. So in other words, by not considering animals, there's a huge missed opportunity just even in Canada in terms of fixing some of their carbon emissions problems. This isn't, the terrestrial realm isn't the only place. The marine realm actually leads to other opportunity through what's called the biological pump, or in some cases, the whale pump. The biological pump includes all of living organisms. The whale pump is one specifically, just whales. So what happens here is in the phototic zone, this is the zone where there's a lot of light. This is where the phytoplankton grow. But the problem is this isn't a very nutrient-rich environment here. There's not a lot of nitrogen, and especially not a lot of nitrogen that phytoplankton need to flourish. But the whales, what they do is they dive deeply, they eat krill and fish down below, and the krill and fish contain these essential nutrients. So when these whales rise to the surface to breathe, they actually poop in the water, and then it leads to a cloud of dissolved feces and urea, which then nourishes the phytoplankton, and you get these phytoplankton blooms that can take up the CO2 in the water. And when these phytoplankton die, then they just sort of snow down to the bottom into the deep ocean and actually get stored there for a long time. Fish do the same, which I'll get into in a minute. But again, it's a small amount in terms of the global carbon budget, but this is just for the Southern Ocean. This isn't for the entire ocean. So if you build up whale populations across all of the oceans, you can really make a substantial dent in the global carbon budget. Here's the fish, right? Fish do the same thing. In terms of the biological pump, they feed and they defecate up in the surface waters. That really leads to phytoplankton production, but they also, through their physiology, they release carbonates because of the need to regulate salt water, and that process actually leads to these tiny rocks that just float down to the bottom of the ocean, and then obviously all the fish fall also. And we're talking here 5.5 gigatons across the entire ocean. This is where you have big gains. We need to protect the ocean because this can put a huge dent in sort of the global carbon budget and the amount of drawdown that we need to have each year. Sea otters, we love these animals. If you've been on an Alaskan cruise, you've seen those on the coast. The sea otters, again, like the wolves, control their herbivore prey, which are these urchins. And these urchins are very devastating to kelp forests. And so without sea otters, you see a lot of urchins, but you don't see a lot of kelp forest. So by restoring the sea otters, they've rebuilt the food web here. And these sea otters, by restoring them, add to about 0.01 gigatons of CO2 annually in deep sea storage through uptake in these kelp forests. And another example, there's a lot of restoration efforts in the prairies. There's a American prairie restoration where they want to bring bison back to one piece of land. But the literature suggests there's about enough area where you could restore bison to 20% of their historical range without leading to conflicts with people and ranches and all other sort of worries where you have a big animal just trudging through areas. And if you just did that, you would get 0.017 gigatons of CO2 annually. So, although each animal has really tiny effects potentially relative to the global carbon budget, if you add all of these things up, and we're including other species that I didn't consider, like sharks and coral reefs and echinoderms, those are things like starfish and sea cucumbers and things like that, you get a total of 6.24 gigatons, which is 3 to 6 times higher than this shortfall. So some of these are already happening, we're just not accounting for them, and some of them we need to sort of strengthen so that we make sure that they're protected or conserved or restored to actually maintain that boost and actually start thinking about other animals. So animating the carbon cycle can, more than make up the global shortfall and even actually match the current planned nature-based solutions that have been offered. Now, I don't want to paint this as a panacea, right? Not all animals are going to be beneficial for the carbon cycle. And there are other things that you have to worry about, like introducing wolves or lions to landscapes could conflict with people and livestock and people's safety. So, there are going to be trade-offs, but we have to think about this holistically. And when we think about it holistically, we actually have to think about people as part of the landscape, not separate from nature. So people in this sort of thinking have to be, consulted. We have to have discussions with the stakeholder communities that are going to have to live with these solutions, or maybe even derive these solutions. But I think, trying to gauge the conversation about restoring wildlife and protecting wildlife through rewilding, trophic rewilding, could actually end up being beneficial to help us meet the goal of reducing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it on the planet. Now, I just, where does all this inspiration come from? You don't just pull it out of the air. Where do you get the evidence that maybe you should think about this? And I just want to talk about things a little more locally, where this is how my thinking about this evolved. And it was really involved in studying things in New England grasslands or old fields that were abandoned from agriculture. And what I do is I study spiders, which are predators, grasshoppers, which are herbivores, and then, vegetation. In old fields, this could be goldenrod or grasses, and grasshoppers eat both kinds of vegetation. And by analogy, we've got a wolf and we've got a moose, and we also have boreal vegetation. And so the inspiration for doing the calculations for the boreal really came from studying these kinds of interactions and the top-down control that these animals have on the vegetation. The beauty of working with these critters is you can actually do the experiments and take apart the ecosystem and remove some of the species and really actually causally identify their role in the system. Whereas you can't do those kinds of experiments with these critters, right? You could certainly shoot them and get rid of them that way, but then maybe if you get rid of them that way, you can't bring them back if you discover they're important. So, it's a lot tougher to do the exacting experiments with large animals, but there are principles we can learn with studying these animals that we can then scale to these animals. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. So I, study the interactions of the grasshopper in the that moves throughout the vegetation canopy, and two kinds of hunting spiders. One is a sit and wait predator that sits in the upper canopy, and then there's an active predator which roams throughout the canopy. So think of this as your puma, and think of this as your wolf, in a sense. And so, and then think about the grasshopper as a deer or an elk or even a buffalo or whatever. So what happens here in this vegetation, the grasshoppers normally eat high up in the canopy here, and then at nighttime when it gets cool, they go down into the litter and hang out in the vegetation here to stay warm. So each day they have to rise up to eat here and rise through this predation gauntlet to feed, and then they go back up and down. So this is sort of almost like a terrestrial biological pump, if you will, because the highest quality, the highest nutrition is up here where there's more photosynthesis going on. In the same way that some of the fish move up to the pelagic zone, into the light zone where they eat the phytoplankton also. Now, we often just think about predators killing their prey and then having indirect beneficial effects on the vegetation by killing their prey. But some predators also scare their prey, right? So it would be the stupid prey that isn't frightened of its predator and try and take evasive tactics, because if it didn't do that, it would be picked off by its predators. And so some of the work that we've been doing is actually looking at how much is the predation effect due to killing prey versus a behavioral response. And one of the trade-off games that are played by the grasshopper sandwiched in between the spider and the grass is that the grass is highly nutritious. The grasshoppers love to eat the grass. That's why they're called grasshoppers. But it's a risky place to feed because the predators can pick them off fairly easily. So what they do is they go into the leafy goldenrod and they hide in there, but they also have to eat. So they eat some of this vegetation also. But it's tougher for the predators to catch and subdue them. So grasshoppers, when they can, will prefer to eat here, but they'll hide in here and eat some in here. So that's the sort of trade-off game because of the fear of predation and trying to avoid being eaten by predators. We call that the landscape of fear. So we've done experiments to really test and see if the landscape of fear can actually induce effects on the plant level. And so we've done experiments where we have plants only in some cages, plants and grasshoppers, and then plants and grasshoppers and the predators. And these are replicated so we can sort of explain how, spatial variation in environmental conditions can account for some of the effects versus, the effects due to these manipulations directly. I'm not going to present the data, but I will present sort of a graphical representation of what you see. So the goldenrod is a very competitive dominant plant. So it will dominate the canopy if there are no herbivores to eat it. And there is a modest amount of grass also growing. But the grasshoppers, in the absence of the predators here, the sit-and-wait predator, the scary predator, will actually eat a lot of grass, but eat a modest amount of goldenrod. But when the predator is in play, then they start eating more goldenrod and less grass. And so they can really change the look of the canopy to something dominated more by understory vegetation here. So they're doing the opposite. The predators are causing the opposite of what the elephants are doing, right? The grasshoppers, in response to being scared by the predators, are removing this canopy species. So in this system, it's actually, it's the opposite of what the elephants are doing. But the question is, these studies were for the sit-and-wait predator, where they sit up in the upper canopy so the grasshoppers know where the risky site is. An active hunting predator roams more widely around. And so if you're constantly in fear, but you're never encountering the predator, you're wasting valuable energy for your survival and reproduction. And so it doesn't make sense evolutionarily to be continuously frightened when you're facing just these kinds of predators. The question is that necessarily true? And if it is true that these predators don't cause fear responses, but are largely more killers, what does that mean for the ecosystem? And so what we've done is, done experiments and hypothesized how this predator would affect the vegetation versus this predator. So again, this predator, by scaring its prey, causes the grasshoppers to switch from feeding on the grass. So this predator has a beneficial effect on the grass, but the grasshoppers hide and feed in the goldenrod, that canopy plant, so they have a negative indirect effect on that vegetation. So these spiders are not very good for this species here. But the species is strongly competitive with all the others, so these herbivores are rearranging the competitive dynamics here. The active hunting predator, because it doesn't induce the fear effects, it just mainly kills the predators when it encounters it infrequently. What you get is that there are fewer grasshoppers to eat the vegetation. So while they're even just not changing their diet, they're still eating the grass. There are fewer of them, so this spider will have beneficial effects on all of the vegetation. And because this is a competitive dominant, you should see this flourish here, but not flourish here. So you do the experiments again, right? So you can sort of test these ideas by manipulating the ecosystem. You have plants only, you have plants and grasshoppers, and you have plants, grasshoppers, and spiders in the system. And when you do that, again, I'm not going to show you the data, I'm just going to show you what the canopy looks like. Sure enough, consistent with predictions, you don't have a lot of goldenrod in the canopy when the spiders or when the grasshoppers are facing this sit-and-wait predator, but it's a dense canopy of goldenrod when you're seeing these active hunting predators. Now, if you look at the ecosystem properties, you see very divergent results. So what we did in this experiment is before we stocked all the animals, we spent 1 year just measuring all of the initial conditions to know what they were before the animals were stocked. Then we stocked the animals, ran the experiment for a couple of years, and then remeasured everything. And so these numbers are the deviation from initial conditions, right? So again, this spider lowers plant diversity. Why? Because it allows that competitive dominant plant to flourish. Whereas the sit-and-wait predator leads to more even community because it's suppressing the abundance of the competitive dominant. But in terms of above ground net primary productivity, and here's where the carbon cycle comes in. Above ground net primary productivity is a measure of how much carbon a plant takes up and stores in its tissue through photosynthesis, right? So active hunting predators, by promoting goldenrod, which is that big plant that stores a lot of carbon, they're beneficial to the carbon. The sit-and-wait predators might not be. So here's an example where some animals might be beneficial, others might not be so beneficial. And if you look at nitrogen cycling also, the active hunting predators are beneficial to the carbon cycle. The sit-and-wait predators might not be so much in this ecosystem. Now, the question is, what does that mean for carbon storage across the landscape, where you might have fields dominated by sit-and-wait predators versus fields dominated by active hunting predators or something in between? So we did a survey, a soil survey, where we sampled soils and looked at how much carbon is stored in the soils by virtue of changing this vegetation structure. And when you change this vegetation structure, a different kind of litter hits the soil and gets absorbed into the soil and gets stored as carbon, right? So we sampled across all of these fields throughout Connecticut. And then, across that environmental gradient, so where you're looking at the percentage of active hunting predators. So the percentage of active hunting predators would be high here, would be very low here. What you have is this rise in carbon storage in the soil. And it goes from 400 grams per meter squared almost to 1100, almost a tripling of soil carbon storage just by changing the predator in this system. Now, to put things in some perspective, this is just a summary or a review of a bunch of studies. So we're talking 537 studies where humans have tried to manage for soil carbon by changing the land use. So they may have changed forest to pasture, or pasture to secondary forest, or crop to secondary forest, or what's germane to what I'm talking about, crop to pasture, right? These abandoned old fields. And what you can see is human interventions are, sometimes causing positive change, sometimes causing negative change. So as humans, we're really not necessarily getting it right all the time, or maybe there isn't the capacity to improve soil storage by changing to these land uses. But notice the percentage change and increase, right? So about 20%, especially crop to pasture. Let's superimpose the data that I found onto this. So basically, in this study, we're looking at a range of 500 to about 750 grams of carbon per meter squared that humans through their management can affect. Here's what nature does, okay? It goes 120% increase if you go from just sit-and-wait predators to active hunting predators. It's much bigger. Nature can do a better job than people. And so this, again, sort of suggests that we should let nature help us along and really look to nature for solutions rather than always trying to do it mechanically or through technology. Now, why don't we see active hunting predators in all fields? Well, that happens to be a consequence of the land use around these old fields. So, basically the degree of forest surrounding the field determines how many active hunting predators dominate in a field. Why is that? Because the active hunting predators actually use the forest edges as habitat, especially for overwintering habitat. So they shuttle back and forth into the forest. So even though they're denizens of the fields in the summer, they need forest habitat in order to promote their abundance. So we can't think of these arthropods just living in old fields. We have to actually think about the landscape matrix of forest and field juxtaposed to actually manage these species if we want to promote carbon cycling. And the benefit is you've also got forests here that are also taking up carbon. So what I'm arguing in this seminar is that we need a change in mindset. Climate change is commonly viewed as causing collateral damage to biodiversity, especially animals, right? That is, their habitats are going to disappear. We're transforming land uses that make it really hazardous for animals to live in their habitats. And animals might not have the physiological capacity to cope with climate change. That's sort of the narrative right now. So animals are viewed as unwitting victims, that they're passengers stuck on a ship that is headed on an ill-fated voyage. And I would argue that we need to change the mindset and see animals actually as important drivers of the ship and maybe even captains of the ship. So biodiversity management and conservation may be a key to fixing the climate problem, especially managing animal diversity. Now, again, I just want to underscore that let's not make this a panacea. Let's not just run out and let all, manage all animals for climate, which is starting to happen a little bit, which is worrisome. We have to be much more deliberate and intentional and really try and understand, what these animals do to ecosystems to make sure that, the climate positive solutions are a real outcome of the animal management. You'll notice I haven't really talked about birds much. Birds are just an unexplored taxon in terms of this idea, and so are reptiles and amphibians. So it's really, people have really focused on insects, arthropods more generally, and they've focused largely on mammals because of their charismatic nature. But birds in the tropics are exceedingly important because they're important seed dispersers, and especially some of the larger birds. Because they take the larger seeds, and those larger seeds, again, like with the elephants, those larger seeds promote the production of carbon-dense trees. And the birds can be crucially important in sustaining high levels of carbon uptake and storage in ecosystems. So a lot more work really needs to be done to study birds, and this is something that Audubon Society could also promote. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And now we're going to open it up for a Q&A that's in the chat. And to assist in facilitating that is Sharon Bruce, who is on camera, as well as myself. So thanks, Sharon, for joining us. Do you want to take on one of the first questions out of chat?
Well, sure. First, I have to learn how to unmute myself. So Bruce asks, in our forest in upstate New York, goldenrod is preventing regeneration of trees, and there is no old field succession. So how does one deal with that? Do you increase the population of the right species? What do you do?
Well, actually, my research has shown that by having that natural food chain with the sit and wait predators, like they're preventing succession from happening. Actually, they're keeping those old fields in an old field state for a longer time than you would expect just from goldenrod succession. So again, what you need to do is look at the animals inside that field and really try and understand the food web relations. And if you wanted to succeed into forest, if that's a goal, then you may have to also think about getting rid of some of the arthropods in the system. But again, in southern New England and Connecticut, in a lot of the landscapes, people actually value this also for cultural reasons. It's a legacy to agriculture in the past. And, Audubon Society actually has a lot of properties where they try and keep these meadows because they also attract a certain diversity of birds that you would lose if the canopy closed in and, became some other kind of habitat. So I think, yes, solving the climate problem by letting forests develop is one thing, but then there are costs and losses, especially with some of the migratory birds that you would lose, okay?
What about, just to riff on that question a little bit further, what about managing the goldenrod in ways other than letting the animal community handle it? I'm thinking of people being tempted to either use an herbicide or even just periodically mowing the meadow to maintain plant diversity. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. There are two things. So first of all, at least in the forest in northeastern Connecticut where we are, the goldenrod's actually beneficial for hickory invasion and pine invasion. Pine needs shade so that it can grow out of the canopy. So I think from that perspective, it depends on what species you're trying to regenerate. But if you want to regenerate trees and you have such a dense canopy of goldenrod that it's preventing it, I would mow. Mowing's quite easy and straightforward, but I wouldn't mow in the fall. And that's the mistake I think a lot of landowners do, is they mow in the fall when it's tall. I would mow in the spring because goldenrod always gets a jump on everything else because it's a fast growing species. So if you knock it back in the spring and keep it back in the spring, it allows some of the other species, the low lying species, to get ahead of the goldenrod and eventually tip the balance.
Great, thank you. Another question in chat. Am I understanding correctly that sit and wait predators increase biodiversity, but that active hunting predators increase carbon sequestration?
That is correct. So here's an example. And when we say biodiversity, I mean plant biodiversity, right? That is correct. And here's an example of the trade-off. You know, what are your values? Do you want to protect biodiversity or do you want to sequester carbon, right? And so those trade-off decisions also have to be made oftentimes. So maybe you want an intermediate combination, so you're willing to back off on some carbon sequestration to have more plant diversity. You want a mix of the two kinds of predators in the system. Yeah.
We've got a few folks who are wondering about how to get the word out more about this research, and especially wondering why it's not being discussed at places like COP27.
I think, yeah, no, that is a really important question. That's, you know, the Global Rewilding Alliance is trying to get the word out. But, you know, there are a lot of people that are saying, show me the money, you know, like when I say money, show me the evidence, not necessarily the money to do it, but show me the evidence, you know, the proof is in the pudding sort of. And again, the case studies I've shown here are the ones that are really well worked out. We're still doing some of the science to figure things out more. But you know, I think, you know, part of the reason also that people aren't paying attention, even the scientific community, is because of that paradigm of the pyramid that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. People still view the world that because the vegetation is so abundant, that's the only thing that matters. And a lot of the people who are doing the Earth systems modeling look at it that way. And so they just ignore you know, the animal biomass in the upper trophic levels. They don't think about the feedbacks. And so it really requires a different worldview, a different scientific worldview than the one that's dominating sort of the science that's informing the policy right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw in a question here. Has anyone studied the relationship between deer and the eastern forest with respect to carbon sequestration, or perhaps the impact of invasive species and deer and the forest with respect to carbon sequestration? I ask because Audubon has a healthy forest initiative that is very focused on maximizing forest health, maximizing species diversity, and thereby making our forest not only good for our wildlife, but also good as a natural climate solution. And just wonder how much of the science is done yet.
It hasn't. People have sort of discussed the carbon benefits, but again, it requires a change in thinking, because right now people view deer as just devastating to forests and forest regeneration, right? And it may be true that, you know, they create gaps that allows vegetation to invade, especially invasive species, then which compete with the canopy trees. And so maybe their numbers need to be controlled if your goal is to increase carbon storage. But, you know, the other thing that I'm finding when I get asked to look into these things is that the deer are being blamed for a lot of the understory effects that actually an invasive jumping worm is causing, actually. You know, when people start looking at the ecosystem, looking at it as an ecosystem rather than a plant herbivore system, we're discovering all sorts of things that are happening in the soil because of other species that are invading also and changing the soil properties. So deer get sort of blamed as the culprit when there are other insidious effects on top of the deer. So, you know, in some cases, when you eradicate those worms, you can find that actually the ecosystem responds more than by eradicating deer. In other places, fair enough, deer do, you know, really chew up the understory and allow invasive species to come in.
Well, you mentioned forest fires in your presentation, and we have a question about how forest fires affect biodiversity.
It depends on whether the biodiversity is adapted to forests. Like Western United States, a lot of the forests require forest fires to regenerate, right? They're serotinous species. They really do rely on, recurrent fires to be productive. The problem is really with those regions is we've suppressed fire for so long. We have so much fuel lying on the forest floor that when a fire comes through, its intensity and extent is bigger than sort of natural fire cycles and recurrent fires, right? And so, historically, certainly fires went through these areas, but they weren't as intense and as hot and as devastating. And so the trees got burnt, but then they could actually release the seeds from their cones. Now they just get, torched and ashed because of the way we've been managing them, not necessarily, so that's why people are arguing, let's increase the fire frequency again. And if there are risky places where people are, also building houses, maybe we should rethink land use allocation in terms of where people sort of live, or trying to figure out how people can build fireproof homes more. Here in the East, fire risk is a little less likely because these forests are more sort of water loving forests, and the tree species here in the East are more adapted to wetter conditions. So, you certainly get drought years, but, you get burns, but things come back again because of the seed banks.
Lots of questions in chat. Here's one about land use conversion by humans from green space to housing developments, other kinds of developments. Does that put us in a huge deficit regarding carbon management?
It can, but it doesn't have to be, because if you intersperse green spaces with housing developments, which a lot of sort of smart urban geographers are doing, they're trying to figure out how do you actually embed some of these principles as part of creating new landscapes in urban areas that are green, that also think about attracting a lot of these insects that could promote some of this functioning, and even thinking about how you treat your landscapes. So I ran a course last fall trying to think about how could we make the Yale campus much more of a natural carbon based system, and looking at a lot of the grounds that Yale manages. It turns out right now, if you just measure the carbon potential that these grounds are taking up, it's about 2 to 3% of the offset that Yale buys for their carbon footprint. So you think, 2 to 3% is small. But if you change the management regimes, right? So you didn't mow as frequently, you changed what grasses you were using, your flower beds, instead of using annuals to let things pretty over the season, actually use natural succession, the phenology. So you plant flowers that are early blooming, midsummer blooming, fall blooming. And so you get that phenological cycle that you do see in meadows or nature, and make perennial beds so you don't have to dig up the soil and disturb the soil and all that, and don't water as frequently. Just simple solutions like that. It turns out you can boost the carbon uptake just in meadows on the campus by up to 15% of recovering the offset that Yale pays for. So again, it doesn't completely cover everything because the land space that Yale covers isn't huge, but you can do things. So if everybody in their neighborhood did these kinds of things in a city, then you could actually have a city footprint be significantly decreased. So these principles apply to urban areas. You just have to be creative about your selection of plants and all that.
Mm-hmm. Hey, we have a question here about the risks of managing rewilding, given the track record that people have with introducing animals to ecosystems. Any comments about that?
There are certainly risks, again, we can't just, I don't want this to be a panacea. We have to recognize that, right? You reintroduce large carnivores to Yellowstone Park, they're going to spill out of the park and kill cattle, right? Those are risks. I think what needs to be done, though, instead of the way things get done nowadays, where an organization says, this is what we're going to try and do, and let's get the government agencies to work with us to implement these solutions, is spend a lot of time working with the community and the stakeholder groups, right? And really try and understand what their concerns are, So certainly cattle ranchers, it's their livelihood that's threatened when you reintroduce wolves. But cattle ranchers, you can have a conversation with them, as they love the land. They're there because they love nature. They just see nature in a different way than people who want to restore predators. But if there were ways to have a conversation and think about, okay, if a predator kills one of your cattle, let's figure out how we compensate you for that, right? And also with carbon sequestration now, let's not just sort of say, okay, this is a passive dividend for the country. Let's actually pay landowners, the carbon benefits because of that. And actually make it financially viable for them as an alternative economic source. So it really comes down to having serious conversations and being respectful of the communities that have to actually live with what's going on. And in some cases, the animals are going to be beneficial. In some cases, they're going to be potentially harmful, but the communities are tolerant and willing to accept that. And in other cases, it will be unacceptable, which means you can't, implement the solution there. But the science alone isn't going to solve this problem. There's a lot of social science and anthropology that needs to be done with these communities to really make this all work.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. This is a bit of a nuts and bolts one. The DEC in New York is paying us to apply herbicides to beech and hay-scented fern. Could you comment on whether or not that's a good idea off the top of your head? And this will be the last question.
First of all, just from a personal perspective, I would never spray pesticides or any kinds of chemicals on a beech, especially when it leaches back into the ocean waters, right?
Beech tree. Sorry.
Oh, beech trees. Okay. Yes. I'm just not a big fan of herbicide use unless it's really strategic, and because it can build up in the soil. Read Rachel Carson and realize that. I think mechanical interventions, while they're harder to work with, are more environmentally friendly, and I'd really like to see us wean ourselves off of just a chemical solution, unless they're biochemicals that are more nature inspired. So there's a whole branch of chemistry called green chemistry, where people are developing new chemicals that are very environmentally friendly and do the job of some of the hazardous chemicals we currently use as herbicides and pesticides.
Great. If anyone has any questions that haven't been answered, please feel free to send to either our Connecticut or New York email addresses, can someone put those in the chat so that we can collect any of those additional questions, and Dr. Schmitz can respond afterwards. And this is all the time that we have. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank Dr. Schmitz very much for today's fascinating presentation and all of your great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.